All right, to help us digest all of that, let's bring in John Allison, CEO of Unio Capital. John, good to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
John, 15 years since September 11th. What is the long-term economic impact or legacy?
I think you mentioned one of these things in your comments, which is lower productivity. I think terrorism has imposed a cost on everybody. We all experience it going through airline lines. Everything is slowed down. There are more security costs and so on. So I think when people look at why productivity is overall lower, I think the cost of terrorism is a small part of that, not the main explanation, but part of it. The second thing is that it's actually slowed the movement of goods and people across borders. You know, it's just longer to get from point A to point B, more checks. Containers have to be inspected. The Europeans are thinking of changing their Schengen, their internal free border system. So you have that, and it's no surprise that with that there is more protectionist sentiment that we've seen, for example, in this election. I think the third legacy is that governments become more powerful. There isn't a war that has ever been fought, and terrorism is a twilight war between sort of regular war and peace, that where governments have not become more powerful because they're looked to deal with security. So I think those are the three big, very long-lasting legacies that continue.
Now, John, be it 9/11 or the more recent attacks that we've seen in Nice and Paris, what are the immediate financial ramifications?
Well, I think actually I was thinking about this. 9/11, in a way, is an icon of what happened. It was, as we know, because I was walking on that Tuesday morning to the office, horrendous immediate impacts. But what was interesting is while they were severe, they were passing and relatively short. So, for example, when 9/11 struck, gold went up, oil went up, the stock market went down. But a month later, the stock market was back where it was. GDP went down by 0.5 percentage point, but then it bounced back. 1 million people were unemployed in the U.S., but they recovered and they came back. There were some others, like 18,000 small businesses were wiped out down in the Wall Street area, and a lot of those did not come back. But generally speaking, they pass relatively quickly after a terrorist attack.
So there has been tremendous resilience, at least in the West and here in the U.S. and in Europe. What do you attribute that to?
Well, I think, first of all, we have very robust social order. So it's not like, Nigeria is an example where it's not such a robust social order. They have lots of terrorist attacks back to back, and that's really harming the overall economy. Here we have enough social order that we can bounce back. And because, remember, it's fairly decentralized, while it makes the TV screens, not all of France has gotten hit. It's not all of the U.S. that's gotten hit.
Well, which sectors do get hurt the most? Because usually travel and tourism do have a longer impact.
Yeah, it's actually remarkably the same for every terrorist incident. Insurance companies get hit. They get claims. I think in 9/11, if I remember correctly, it was something like $40 billion of claims. They had to pay them out. That was permanent. The travel industry gets hit, but it's temporary. Whether it's an airline or whether it's a cruise ship, they come back. So typically, those are very good opportunities. And then, longer term, there are other industries that benefit.
Well, John, you mentioned Nigeria, and when we say terrorist attacks here, we tend to think of the U.S. and what we've seen recently in Europe with the increase of ISIS. But countries like Nigeria, like Kenya, like Sudan, they've been dealing with the likes of Boko Haram, the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. How does that impact their GDP and foreign direct investment?
It has actually impacted it very badly. So they've been hurt, and they've been permanently hurt. It's not been the same thing as I said earlier about it being passing and short, because it's continually undermining the social order, and it continually undermines foreigners who want to invest. We happen to know people who invest in Nigeria, and it has an effect on how fast they can invest and in what amounts they can invest. So I think in Africa, it's a very, very a serious and unpleasant drag on their economic wealth.
How are we seeing terrorism increase the costs of security, for example, in multinational corporations? How much of a drag is that on their bottom line?
Well, the only number actually, there's not good numbers, so I'll give you sort of a global number. It's estimated that $100 to $200 billion is spent now on terrorist-related security of all kinds around the world. That's direct costs, people that are doing specific things. So that's not such a huge number in comparison to a very big global economy, but it's not a trivial number either. And then there are the secondary effects. You were mentioning the wars. Defense departments are devoting more of their resources to terrorism than they did before. So nobody has actually calculated the total cost, but there's no question if we had no terrorism, all those costs would just go away. So they are a drag. There's no good explanation beyond that.
John, we have seen the markets bounce back with quite fast resilience, especially to the more recent terrorist attacks. But there is concern that central banks around the world do not have any ammunition left should a real catastrophic event take place. And particularly, there's been concern about that here in the U.S. with the Fed. What do you think?
You know, I've said this to you before on your show, and I hate being the optimist all the time, but I have a lot of confidence in central banks' power. It dates me a little bit, but I've been from, you know, the 1987 crash onward. I've seen every major crash. I studied central banks carefully. I think they've got an enormous amount of firepower they could bring to bear, as they did in 9/11, where the discount window was open and they, you know, plowed lots of money. And so personally, that's not my worry. I'm much more worried about cyber terrorism, which we've never really experienced on a big scale, and then who would handle that and how long it would take to unravel that.
And what kind of impact would that have economically?
Well, part of the problem is we don't actually know what the it would be. So, for example, if cyber terrorism caused, you know, half of the grid of the United States to go down, and it went down for, if it went down for an hour, we could handle it. If it went down for a day, it'd be not easy. If it went down for a week or a month, it would be much more serious. So actually, I'm much more concerned about the part we don't know anything about, right, and the part we haven't been spending the money on as much as I think we probably ought to.
Your unknown unknowns, as Rumsfeld would say.
Exactly.
All right, thank you so much, John Allison, CEO of Unio Capital.